Autumn in the city always carried a kind of quiet energy. The mornings were cool, the sidewalks damp with the remnants of the night's rain, and the leaves painted the streets with rich reds and oranges. I'd often sit by the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the world come to life as Sophia moved about the house. Usually, her presence brought a sense of calm, a steady hum in the background of my otherwise chaotic days as CEO of my tech company. But lately, that hum had changed. It started small, as these things often do. Sophia had always been a woman of routines. Mornings were reserved for yoga, afternoons for her freelance design projects, and evenings were ours. A sacred ritual of wine, conversation, and laughter. But the routines began to unravel. Her yoga sessions stretched longer. She started taking her laptop to trendy cafes instead of working from her sunny corner of the living room. Our evenings became sporadic, with her excusing herself for charity galas or networking events that I didn't remember her ever showing much interest in before. I didn't think much of it at first. I chalked it up to her wanting to branch out, to redefine her identity outside of being Victor Steele's wife. After all, she'd always been independent, someone who needed her own space to flourish. But then came the subtle shifts, too minor to be accusations but just big enough to raise a brow. She started coming home with dresses that seemed out of place for her usual understated style. Emerald greens, deep plums, fabrics that shimmered under the light. When I asked about them, she'd shrug and say, "It's just for a dinner I'm attending," or, "You always say I should treat myself." And she wasn't wrong. I had said those things. But the Sophia I knew had never needed a nudge to treat herself. Then there were the late-night texts. At first, I didn't notice because her phone was always face down, silenced during dinner. But one night, while we ate a quiet meal of roasted chicken and vegetables, her phone buzzed insistently. She flipped it over, a flicker of hesitation in her movements, and smiled at whatever was on the screen. "Who's that?" I asked, more curious than accusatory. "Evan," she replied casually, her eyes not meeting mine. "He's just being ridiculous." Evan. My best friend since high school. The guy who had shared beers with me on the bleachers after football games, who'd stood beside me as my best man when Sophia and I exchanged vows. The guy who had been like a brother to me. I didn't think much of it then. Evan had always had a way of making people laugh, Sophia included. But the way she said his name felt different, lighter, almost playful. I tried to shake it off, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. In the days that followed, I couldn't help but notice things I hadn't before. The way Evan and Sophia shared glances during group dinners. Small, fleeting, but loaded with something unspoken. Or how she laughed just a little too loudly at his jokes, her hand brushing his arm when she reached for her glass of wine. Once, at a charity event I'd reluctantly attended, I watched them from across the room. They were deep in conversation, heads close, as if the entire crowd around them didn't exist. My first instinct was to dismiss it. Sophia and Evan were both social butterflies, the kind of people who could talk to anyone about anything. And yet, there was an ease between them that felt misplaced. Something I couldn't quite name. Evan, for his part, seemed to be avoiding me. He'd cancel plans last minute or text vague excuses about being too busy. It wasn't like him. Normally, he'd be the first to suggest a drink after work or a round of golf on the weekends. I tried to brush off the unease creeping into the edges of my mind. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe Sophia was just thriving in a way I hadn't seen before. Maybe Evan was genuinely busy. But late one night, as I lay awake in bed with Sophia's soft breaths beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. Something important. The next few weeks passed in a strange blur. On the surface, everything seemed fine. Sophia was her usual charming self, smiling warmly when we bumped into neighbors or attended the rare dinner party together. But behind closed doors, something was missing. It was hard to put my finger on, like a faint buzzing in the background of a song, almost imperceptible but impossible to ignore once you noticed it. She had started spending more time networking. That's what she called it: brunches, charity luncheons, art gallery openings. Events that seemed carefully curated for a crowd she used to call pretentious. I tried to convince myself she was just exploring new interests, but there was a moment that shattered that illusion. One evening, I came home earlier than expected, eager to surprise her. I'd been feeling the distance between us growing and thought maybe a quiet night in would help. I picked up her favorite wine, a bold red from Napa, and her favorite takeout from the little Italian place we both loved. When I walked in, the house was silent except for the faint hum of music coming from upstairs. It wasn't unusual for Sophia to play music while she worked, but something about it felt out of place. I climbed the stairs, the bag of takeout swinging in my hand, and paused outside her office door. It was ajar, just enough for me to see her sitting at her desk, her back to me, deep in conversation on her phone. I waited a moment, not wanting to interrupt. But as I stood there, I caught a snippet of her voice, light and teasing. "You're terrible," she said, laughing softly. "You're going to get me in trouble." The words hit me like a slap. My first thought was that I had misheard, that I was overreacting. But then she said his name, Evan, and my stomach dropped. I pushed the door open slightly, enough to make her turn around. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she quickly ended the call. "Victor, I didn't hear you come in." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I got dinner," I said, holding up the bag. My voice sounded strained even to me. "That's sweet," she replied, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "Let me just finish up here, and I'll meet you downstairs." I nodded, forcing a smile, and retreated to the kitchen. My appetite had vanished, but I set the table anyway, pouring 2 glasses of wine and arranging the pasta on plates. She came down a few minutes later, her face carefully composed, and we ate in near silence. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that she and Evan had always been close, that their banter was harmless. But the way she had ended that call, the slight tension in her posture, it didn't sit right with me. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. Over breakfast, I casually mentioned that I hadn't seen Evan in a while. "He's been busy," she said quickly, barely looking up from her coffee. "Busy with what?" I pressed, keeping my tone light. "Work, I think," she replied, finally meeting my gaze. Her smile was too quick, too practiced. "Why? Are you feeling neglected?" I laughed, though it felt hollow. "Maybe a little. I thought I was your favorite guy." "You are," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. But her touch didn't carry the usual warmth, and her smile didn't quite meet her eyes. That night, I found myself lying awake again, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed the past few months in excruciating detail. The whispered phone calls, the sudden interest in events I had never even heard her mention before, the way Evan's name seemed to linger just a little too long in her sentences. I didn't want to be that husband, the paranoid, insecure man who couldn't trust his wife. But the patterns were there, growing louder with each passing day. And the worst part was, deep down, I already knew the truth. The unease lingered like a shadow, stretching further into my days. At work, I found myself distracted, replaying conversations with Sophia in my head, searching for hidden meanings. Even small things felt loaded now. A text she'd respond to a little too quickly, a fleeting smile when she thought I wasn't looking. It all came to a head the evening we attended a charity auction together. It was one of those glitzy affairs, the kind Sophia now seemed to thrive in. She wore a shimmering silver gown, her hair swept up in a way that made her look effortlessly elegant. I had always been proud to have her by my side. But tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the man she truly wanted to be there with. The event was held at the Art Museum downtown, the kind of venue where the lighting was dim and the champagne flowed endlessly. As we mingled with the crowd, I noticed Sophia scanning the room, her eyes darting from face to face. "Looking for someone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She hesitated just a second too long. "No, just taking it all in," she said with a smile that felt rehearsed. Not long after, I spotted Evan across the room. He was talking to a group of people, his trademark charm on full display. I hadn't seen him in weeks, and I felt an odd mix of anger and relief. If he was here, maybe I could finally confront him, clear the air and put this gnawing doubt to rest. But before I could make my way over, Sophia slipped away from my side. I watched as she crossed the room, her movements deliberate, her gaze locked on Evan. She reached him just as his group dispersed, and they stepped to the side, speaking in hushed tones. I stayed where I was, rooted to the spot, pretending to examine a sculpture while my heart hammered in my chest. From the distance, their exchange looked innocent enough, but the way Sophia tilted her head, the way Evan leaned in closer, it felt too familiar. By the time I managed to compose myself and approach them, their conversation had ended. Evan spotted me first, his face lighting up with an exaggerated smile. "Victor. Long time no see," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Yeah, it has been," I replied, my tone tighter than I intended. "I was just catching up with Sophia," he said, as if that explained everything. Sophia chimed in, her voice breezy. "Evan was telling me about this amazing piece he's bidding on tonight. You have to see it. It's stunning." I nodded, forcing a smile, and the three of us fell into a strained conversation about the auction. But I wasn't really listening. My focus was on their body language. How they stood just a little too close. How their laughter overlapped like they shared a secret I wasn't part of. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I tried to engage with other guests, to laugh at the right moments and act like the confident CEO I was supposed to be. But my mind kept circling back to Sophia and Evan, replaying every glance, every laugh, every seemingly innocent interaction. By the time we got home, the tension between us was palpable. Sophia went upstairs to change, and I poured myself a drink, staring out the window at the darkened street below. When she finally came back down, dressed in her usual comfy pajamas, I decided to test the waters again. "You and Evan seem to be having a good time tonight," I said casually, swirling the whiskey in my glass. She froze for a fraction of a second before settling onto the couch. "He was just being his usual charming self," she said, her tone light. "Yeah," I said, setting my glass down with a little more force than I intended. "He's always been good at that." She didn't respond, just gave me a thin smile before turning her attention to the TV. And that was when I knew. She wasn't going to admit anything. Not yet. But there was something between them, something she wasn't telling me. I made up my mind that night. If I was going to get to the bottom of this, I couldn't rely on Sophia to come clean. I needed to dig deeper, to find the missing pieces of the puzzle on my own. In the days following the auction, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing control of my own life. Sophia carried on as though nothing was wrong, cheerful in the mornings, quick to ask about my day when I came home, and thoughtful in the little ways she always had been. She'd pack me lunch on days she knew I had back-to-back meetings or remind me to take breaks when I buried myself in work. But those moments felt hollow now, like window dressing for something darker underneath. It was the little inconsistencies that gnawed at me. She wasn't lying outright. She didn't need to. It was the half-truths, the omissions, the practiced ease with which she maneuvered around my questions. I started noticing patterns. She was on her phone more often, always careful to tilt the screen away from me. If I walked into the room, she'd lock it with a quick flick of her thumb and smile at me like nothing had happened. "You've been busy lately," I remarked one evening as she sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. "Just catching up on emails," she replied without looking up. "Emails must be exciting these days," I said, trying to keep my tone light. She chuckled, finally glancing up at me. "It's just boring work stuff, Victor. Nothing worth your attention." She said it so easily, so convincingly, that I almost let it go. Almost. Then there were her absences. She'd leave for the gym in the mornings, but her usual hour-long workouts stretched to 2. Sometimes she'd come home flushed and energized, claiming she'd stayed for a smoothie or chatted with friends she'd run into. But one morning, when I called her gym to inquire about renewing her membership, the receptionist hesitated before saying, "I'm sorry, Mr. Steele, but Sophia hasn't checked in here for over a month." I didn't confront her right away. I needed to be sure, really sure, before I said anything. So I started paying closer attention, gathering details like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Sophia's schedule had always been predictable, almost comforting in its regularity. But now, there were gaps I couldn't explain. The volunteer work she mentioned suddenly seemed suspiciously vague. The yoga class she'd attended religiously for years was replaced with trying new studios. One afternoon, I came home early again, claiming a canceled meeting. Sophia wasn't there, but her laptop was open on the dining table. I wasn't the kind of man to snoop, at least, I hadn't been before, but curiosity and suspicion overrode my better instincts. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the glowing screen before moving the cursor to wake it up. It opened to her email account, and for a moment, all I saw were mundane messages, store promotions, RSVP confirmations, and a thread about a charity event. But then, near the top of her inbox, was a name that froze me in place. Evan Grant. My pulse quickened as I clicked on the thread. The subject line was harmless, details for Thursday, but the content was anything but. Evan's message was short. "Looking forward to seeing you. Same place as last time." And Sophia's response, sent just that morning. "Of course. Can't wait." I felt the room tilt, my hands tightening into fists at my sides. I stared at the screen, willing the words to change, to mean something other than what they so clearly implied. I closed the laptop and sat down, my heart pounding. There it was, confirmation of something I'd been too afraid to admit even to myself. They weren't just friends. This wasn't just casual. That night, I tried to act normal, but the weight of what I'd seen bore down on me. Sophia noticed, of course. "You seem quiet," she said as we cleaned up after dinner. "Just tired," I lied, forcing a smile. "Long day." She studied me for a moment, her brow furrowing slightly, but she didn't press. As I lay awake again that night, I made up my mind. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Sophia was hiding something, and Evan was at the center of it. I didn't know exactly how far it had gone, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this slide. By the next morning, my decision felt like a weight lifted off my chest. I wasn't going to confront Sophia directly. Not yet. Confrontation gave her control, a chance to deny or deflect. I needed the truth, something undeniable, and to get that, I had to play the long game. The first step was subtle. I started asking questions. Not too many, not all at once, just enough to gauge her reactions. "So, what's on your agenda today?" I asked over breakfast, stirring cream into my coffee. Sophia didn't even flinch. The usual. Meeting a friend for lunch. Then probably some errands. "Why?" "Just curious," I said lightly. "Maybe I'll meet you for lunch one day. It's been a while since we've had a weekday date." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're sweet, but these lunches are just boring catch-ups. Not exactly date material." Her ease unsettled me. There wasn't a flicker of guilt in her expression, no hesitation in her tone. Either she was telling the truth, or she'd grown adept at lying. Later that day, while she was out, I took the next step. I called a private investigator, a man named Martin Hayes, recommended discreetly by a colleague who'd gone through a messy divorce. "You sure about this?" Martin asked after I explained the situation. "Not entirely," I admitted. "But I need to know. I can't keep guessing." "Understood," he said. "I'll keep it discreet. Send me her schedule, details about her usual spots, and anything else you think might help." I hesitated, then added, "And keep an eye on a man named Evan Grant. He's part of the equation." Once we hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. I didn't want to be the man who hired someone to spy on his wife. But I also didn't want to be the man who lived in ignorance, blind to the truth staring him in the face. Over the next few days, I played my role as the trusting husband while Martin worked in the background. Sophia's behavior didn't change. If anything, she seemed more relaxed, as though my calm demeanor had reassured her. "I think we should plan a weekend getaway," she suggested one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "Sounds nice," I said, keeping my voice even. "Any place in mind?" "Maybe the mountains," she said, leaning against the counter. "Just the two of us. We haven't had a proper escape in ages." The suggestion caught me off guard, and for a moment, I let myself believe her. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe this was all in my head, a storm I'd created out of nothing. But then my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Martin. "Call me. Got something." "Everything okay?" Sophia asked, glancing at my phone. "Work," I said quickly, sliding it into my pocket. "I'll handle it later." That night, I stepped out onto the patio under the guise of getting some fresh air and called Martin back. "Tell me," I said, my voice low. "She's been meeting him," Martin said without preamble. "Evan. I've got pictures, coffee shops, a hotel bar downtown. Nothing incriminating yet, but the body language speaks volumes. They're comfortable with each other in a way that isn't just friendly." My grip on the phone tightened. "When was the last time?" "This morning," he said. "A cafe near the park." They sat in a corner booth for over an hour, talking. No signs of PDA, but it's clear they're close. The calm I'd been clinging to all day cracked, anger simmering just below the surface. "Keep watching," I said. "I want proof. Solid proof." Martin assured me he would, and I ended the call, staring out at the darkened yard. The cool night air did little to calm me. Sophia wanted to plan a weekend getaway. She smiled at me like everything was fine, like there weren't lies piling up between us. And Evan, my best friend, was sitting across from her in a cafe, no doubt laughing, talking, sharing in a betrayal I hadn't even fully uncovered yet. I went back inside, my face carefully neutral. Sophia was curled up on the couch, watching one of her favorite shows, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the TV. She looked up as I entered, smiling warmly. "Everything okay?" she asked again. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just work stuff." As I sat down beside her, she leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder. I let her stay there, my arm loosely draped around her. But in my mind, a plan was already taking shape. She thought she was 2 steps ahead of me. She had no idea how far I was willing to go to catch up. The days that followed were marked by a tense routine. I pretended to go about my life as if everything were normal, laughing at Sophia's anecdotes over dinner, nodding along when she told me about her day. But every interaction felt like a lie, a charade I was barely able to maintain. Martin's updates trickled in like drops of poison, each one solidifying the reality I had tried to deny. The meetings continued. Cafes, parks, even an upscale restaurant where they shared a bottle of wine over what looked like a leisurely lunch. Always careful, always just on the edge of plausible deniability. "You're right to be suspicious," Martin told me during one of our calls. "They're smart, but not invincible. If there's more, we'll find it." I started laying the groundwork for my own plan, one that would unravel the comfortable little world Sophia and Evan had built behind my back. It wasn't just about exposing their betrayal, it was about ensuring that neither of them could recover from the damage they'd inflicted on me. One evening, Sophia approached me with an air of excitement. "I have an idea," she said, sitting beside me on the couch. "Let's host a dinner party." I raised an eyebrow. "A dinner party?" "Yeah," she said brightly. "It's been ages since we had everyone over. It could be fun. Good food, good wine, catching up with friends." I knew exactly what this was. A way to cement the image of a perfect marriage, to throw me off the scent. "Sounds like a great idea," I said, forcing a smile. "When were you thinking?" "This weekend," she said. "I'll handle the invites and the food. You just have to show up." "Deal," I said, leaning back against the couch. Inwardly, I was already shifting pieces into place. A dinner party was the perfect opportunity, a way to observe, to test the waters, and maybe even to push a little. If Evan was invited, I'd finally have a chance to confront him in my own subtle way, to gauge his reaction when he looked me in the eye. The rest of the week passed in a flurry of preparation. Sophia was in her element, planning menus and choosing wines, her excitement almost contagious. She insisted on handling everything herself, even hiring a caterer so she wouldn't have to spend the evening in the kitchen. "You're really going all out," I said one evening as she arranged flowers for the dining table. "I want it to be special," she replied, her voice light. I nodded, watching her carefully. She was good at this, creating an atmosphere of warmth and perfection. But I wasn't the same man I'd been a few weeks ago. I knew better now. The night of the party arrived, and our house was transformed into a glowing oasis of soft lighting, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Our closest friends mingled in the living room, their conversations blending into a cheerful hum. And then Evan walked in. He was dressed sharply, his easy charm on full display as he greeted Sophia with a warm hug and me with a firm handshake. "Victor," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks for having me." "Of course," I replied, matching his tone. "It's been too long." As the evening wore on, I made it a point to observe him closely. He moved through the room with practiced ease, chatting with everyone, but he always found his way back to Sophia. They didn't stay together for long, just brief moments here and there, but it was enough to set my teeth on edge. When dessert was served, I decided it was time to push. "So, Evan," I said, my voice carrying just enough weight to draw the attention of the group, "what's been keeping you so busy these days? I barely see you anymore." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "Just work, mostly. You know how it is." "Work must be interesting," I said, holding his gaze. "You seem to find time for plenty of lunches, though." Sophia's hand froze mid-reach for her glass, her eyes darting to mine. "Victor," she said with a nervous laugh, "that's hardly fair. You know how busy Evan's schedule is." Busy, but not too busy for you apparently, I said, my tone still light but laced with enough edge to make my point. The room fell silent for a beat too long, the tension palpable. Evan smiled, though it looked forced. Victor, I think you're misreading things, he said smoothly. Am I? I asked, leaning back in my chair. I hope so. The moment passed quickly, the conversation shifting to safer topics, but the damage was done. Sophia avoided my gaze for the rest of the evening, and Evan made a point of leaving early, his usual confidence shaken. As I watched them retreat, I felt the first stirrings of satisfaction. This was only the beginning. The morning after the dinner party, the house was eerily quiet. The remnants of the night, a few empty glasses, a stray napkin under the table, seemed almost mocking. Sophia was in the kitchen, humming softly as she made coffee, the picture of calm. Last night went well, she said, her back to me. Everyone seemed to have a great time. Yeah, I replied, leaning against the doorway. It was illuminating. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression carefully neutral. What do you mean? Oh, just nice to catch up with everyone, I said casually. It's always interesting to see who gravitates toward whom in a group setting. Her hands faltered for the briefest moment as she poured her coffee, but she quickly recovered, turning to face me with a smile. People are creatures of habit, I guess. Sure are, I said, holding her gaze. The tension between us was thick enough to cut, but neither of us acknowledged it outright. Sophia handed me a cup of coffee and breezed past me, heading for the living room. I followed her, sitting down across from her on the couch. Evan left early last night, I said, taking a sip of my coffee. He said he wasn't feeling well, she replied quickly. Too quickly. Seemed fine when he got here, I said, watching her closely. Sophia's smile tightened, but she didn't look up from her cup. You know how it is. Sometimes things hit you out of nowhere. I didn't respond, letting the silence stretch between us. Finally, she stood, brushing non-existent lint from her sweater. I'm going to take a shower. Let me know if you need anything before I head out later. Heading out? I asked, my tone casual. Yeah, just some errands, she said over her shoulder as she disappeared up the stairs. Once she was out of earshot, I pulled out my phone and texted Martin. Any movement on her or Evan this morning? The reply came quickly. Not yet. We'll keep you updated. I knew it was only a matter of time before they slipped up again. The dinner party had rattled them, Evan's forced smile, Sophia's nervous glances. The cracks were starting to show. Later that afternoon, Sophia left the house. Her usual effortless confidence dimmed ever so slightly. I waited a few minutes before calling Martin. She's on the move, I said. You tracking her? Already on it, he replied. She just pulled into a parking garage downtown. Let's see where she goes. I spent the next hour pacing the house, alternating between anger and a strange, almost clinical curiosity. What excuse would she have this time? How would she spin it when the truth finally came out? Martin called back just as I was about to lose my patience. She's meeting Evan, he said, his tone grim. Same cafe as before. They're in a corner booth. Talking, nothing physical yet. Yet, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. Do you want me to confront them? He asked. No, I said quickly. Not yet. Just get me proof. Something concrete. Understood, Martin said. When Sophia returned home that evening, she was unusually cheerful, as though overcompensating for something. Errands took longer than I thought, she said, kissing me on the cheek. How was your day? Uneventful, I replied, forcing a smile. As we ate dinner, I watched her closely. She was good, laughing at the right moments, asking about my day as if everything were normal. But there was a slight edge to her, a nervous energy she couldn't quite hide. After dinner, I excused myself to my office, claiming work. Instead, I called Martin again. Did you get what you need? I asked. Oh yeah, he said. Pictures, timestamps, everything. You've got your proof. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. Send it over. Will do, he said. And Victor, I've seen a lot of these cases. You're handling this better than most. Just remember, once you use this, there's no going back. I'm counting on it, I said, ending the call. When the photos arrived in my inbox an hour later, I opened them with a strange sense of detachment. There they were, Sophia and Evan, leaning across the table, their heads close. Her hand resting lightly on his arm, his eyes locked on hers. There was no mistaking it now. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity. The charade was over. The only question now was how, and when, I would bring it all crashing down. The photos sat in my inbox like a loaded gun. I stared at them long after I'd closed the laptop, my mind racing with possibilities. I could confront Sophia outright, demand answers, force her to explain herself. But that felt too simple, too reactive. She and Evan had planned this betrayal meticulously, weaving it into the fabric of my life while I remained oblivious. If I was going to address it, I wanted to do it on my terms. The next morning, I decided to make my first move. Over breakfast, I kept my tone light, casual, as if nothing had changed. "Sophia," I said, folding the paper I hadn't been reading. "I was thinking we should go away for a weekend. Just the two of us." Her fork paused mid-air, surprise flickering across her face before she recovered. "That sounds lovely," she said, smiling. "Any place in mind?" "Maybe a cabin," I said, sipping my coffee. "Somewhere quiet. We could both use a break from everything, don't you think?" She nodded, her smile lingering. "That does sound nice. Let me check my schedule." "I already looked," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Next weekend is wide open for both of us." Her smile faltered, just for a second. "Perfect," she said. The seed was planted. I didn't know whether she'd genuinely want to go or if she'd scramble for an excuse to back out. Either way, it gave me time to plan. Later that day, I called Martin. "I need you to find out what Evan's doing next weekend," I said. "If he's not traveling, I want to know exactly where he'll be." "Understood," Martin said. "What's the angle?" "Just making sure my bases are covered," I replied, avoiding specifics. The rest of the week passed in a blur. Sophia continued her routines, some real, some fabricated, and I played my role as the doting husband. On Thursday, I casually brought up the weekend getaway again. "Did you pack for the trip yet?" I asked as she flipped through a magazine. "I was going to do that tomorrow," she said, her tone airy. "What about you?" "I'll throw a bag together," I said. But she didn't ask for details. No follow-up questions about the cabin, the location, or how long we'd be gone. It confirmed what I'd suspected. She wasn't planning to go at all. Friday evening, as Sophia prepared for her work meeting, I received a text from Martin. "Evan has dinner reservations tomorrow at 7. Private room. Party of 2. My jaw tightened. The timeline lined up perfectly. Sophia hadn't just decided to skip our trip. She was planning to spend the evening with him. When she came downstairs, dressed impeccably as always, I forced a smile. "Late night?" I asked. "Probably," she said, kissing my cheek. "Don't wait up." I nodded, watching her leave, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and determination. The next evening, as Sophia slipped out under the pretense of running errands, I made my own preparations. Martin had provided the address of the restaurant, along with a detailed description of the private room's location. When I arrived, I kept my distance, watching from across the street as Sophia greeted Evan with a quick embrace. They disappeared into the building together, their steps light, their conversation easy. I waited a few minutes before heading inside, my pulse steady despite the storm brewing inside me. The hostess barely glanced at me as I walked past her, heading toward the private dining area Martin had described. When I reached the room, the door was slightly ajar. I could hear their voices, low, intimate, tinged with laughter. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. "Am I interrupting?" I asked, my voice calm but cold. The effect was instant. Sophia froze, her face draining of color as she turned to look at me. Evan's confident demeanor cracked, his eyes widening in shock. "Victor," Sophia stammered, rising from her seat. "What are you?" "I could ask you the same thing," I said, stepping inside and closing the door behind me. For a moment, none of them spoke, the air in the room thick with tension. "You've been busy," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket. I swiped to the photos Martin had sent me and held the screen up for them to see. "Care to explain?" Evan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Sophia's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. "This isn't what it looks like," she began, her voice trembling. "Then what is it, Sophia?" I demanded, my tone sharp. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my wife and my best friend have been sneaking around behind my back for months." Evan finally found his voice, though it was shaky. "Victor, it's not. We didn't mean for this to happen." I barked out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the small room. "Didn't mean for it to happen? That's your defense." Neither of them had an answer, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The facade was broken, the truth laid bare. But this was only the beginning. The air in the private dining room was suffocating, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Sophia and Evan sat across from me, their expressions a mix of guilt and panic. It was a strange thing, watching them squirm after weeks of suspecting but not knowing. Now, there was no more hiding. I leaned back in the chair I'd pulled up, keeping my posture relaxed. So I began, my tone deceptively calm. Let's hear it. How long? Sophia's eyes darted to Evan, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. Victor, please. How long? My voice didn't rise, but the weight behind it was enough to cut her off. Evan cleared his throat, his usual confidence replaced by a stammer. It started a few months ago. A few months. I repeated, my gaze narrowing. Define a few. Sophia dropped her head into her hands, her voice muffled. 6 months, she whispered. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of stolen moments and whispered excuses. My jaw tightened as I absorbed the revelation, the timeline clicking into place with sickening clarity. 6 months, I said slowly, my tone laced with mock disbelief. That's impressive. You managed to stab me in the back for half a year without me catching on. Guess I underestimated both of you. Victor, Sophia said, her voice breaking as she looked up at me. I never wanted to hurt you. I laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made her flinch. That's rich. You didn't want to hurt me? What did you think this would do? That I'd congratulate you for finding happiness with my best friend? Evan leaned forward, his palms flat on the table. Look, we didn't plan for this to happen. It happened. I turned my gaze to him, the anger simmering just beneath my calm exterior. It just happened. What a convenient excuse. Tell me, Evan, did it just happen every time you met her behind my back? Every text, every call, every dinner like this one? He had no response, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. And Sophia, I continued, shifting my attention to her. Did you even feel guilty? Or was that part of the thrill, the sneaking around, the lies? Her lip trembled as tears welled in her eyes. I do feel guilty, she said, her voice shaking. Every day. I hate myself for what I've done. Good, I snapped, the calm cracking for the first time. You should. The room fell silent again, the only sound the faint murmur of voices from the restaurant beyond the closed door. I stood slowly, pushing my chair back with deliberate force. This doesn't end here, I said, my voice low and steady. You've destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life, about us. But I'm not walking away quietly. Sophia reached for me, desperation etched into her face. Victor, please. I stepped back, avoiding her touch. Don't. You don't get to ask me for anything. Evan, for all his usual bravado, remained silent, his head bowed as if he'd already accepted defeat. I trusted you, I said, looking between the two of them. Both of you. And you threw it all away. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them to sit in the wreckage of their deceit. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt an odd mix of emotions. Anger, betrayal, sadness, and something else. Resolve. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. They thought they could break me, but they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The drive home was a blur. The street seemed quieter than usual, the streetlights casting long shadows on the empty sidewalks. My mind, however, was anything but quiet. Sophia's tear-streaked face, Evan's stammering excuses, they played on a loop, fueling the storm building inside me. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had already begun forming a plan. Confronting them was only the first step. Now it was time to take control, to ensure they felt the consequences of their betrayal in ways they'd never forget. The house was dark when I entered, a stark contrast to the chaos in my head. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light as I sank into the leather armchair in my office. My thoughts churned as I scrolled through the photos Martin had sent, each one a dagger to the heart, but also a weapon in my arsenal. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. This wasn't just about Sophia and Evan. Their betrayal had spilled into every corner of my life. My home, my trust, even the company I'd built from the ground up. Evan had been involved in the business for years, a partner I once believed I could rely on. Now, I saw his presence for what it was. A liability. I spent the day at the office, carefully laying the groundwork for what was to come. First, I met with the company's legal team, framing my concerns under the guise of protecting intellectual property and ensuring the stability of our leadership. I want a comprehensive audit of all executive communications, I told them, keeping my tone professional. Nothing invasive, just a routine check to ensure compliance and security. The head of legal raised an eyebrow but nodded. Understood. We'll get started right away. Next, I scheduled a meeting with our financial advisor. Evan's role in the company gave him access to sensitive information, and I needed to ensure he couldn't leverage it against me. Keep this between us, I said firmly. It's purely precautionary. By the time I returned home that evening, I felt the first stirrings of control returning to me. Sophia greeted me at the door, her expression guarded. Victor, she began, her voice tentative. Can we talk? I brushed past her, setting my briefcase down on the kitchen counter. Not now, I said curtly. She flinched but didn't press, retreating into the living room. I followed her after a moment, my tone softening just enough to mask my true intentions. Actually, there is something we need to discuss. Her eyes widened slightly, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. What is it? I've been thinking, I said, sitting across from her. Maybe we need some space. A trial separation. Her breath hitched, and I saw the panic flash in her eyes. Space. Victor, no. Hear me out, I interrupted, keeping my tone measured. We've both been under a lot of stress, and I think some distance might help us figure out what we really want. What I want is to fix this, she said desperately. Then prove it, I said, my gaze hard. Take some time to think about what you've done, about what this marriage means to you. Because right now, I'm not sure I see a way forward. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia looked down, her shoulders trembling as she fought back tears. I'll stay with my sister for a while, she finally whispered. Good, I said, standing. Take as long as you need. As I left the room, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. She thought this was about fixing our marriage, about giving her a chance to redeem herself. What she didn't know was that I had no intention of reconciliation. This wasn't about saving what was broken. It was about taking back what was mine. By the time Sophia left for her sister's house, the atmosphere in the house felt different. Quieter, emptier, but also freer. I stood in the doorway and watched her load her suitcase into the car, her eyes darting back to me as though waiting for some sign of forgiveness. She wouldn't get it, not now. I'll call you, she said softly before climbing into the driver's seat. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The sound of her car pulling out of the driveway lingered long after she was gone. The next phase of my plan required precision. With Sophia out of the house, I had time and space to operate without interruption. I started with the legal team's findings from the company audit. Nothing major yet, the head of legal reported during our scheduled meeting. But we flagged a few irregularities in the communication logs. Specifically, emails between Mr. Grant and an external party we couldn't immediately identify. We're looking into it. Good, I said, keeping my tone calm despite the adrenaline coursing through me. Keep me updated. Evan was careful, too careful. His betrayal with Sophia was emotional, personal. But if there was any indication he'd compromised the business, I'd find it. That evening, I sat at my desk and reviewed the photos from Martin once more. Each image told the same story. Two people growing closer in the shadows, weaving their lives together at my expense. I thought back to our last confrontation in the restaurant. Their excuses had been pathetic, their guilt poorly masked. Still, they thought they'd gotten away with it. They believed the worst had passed. That belief would be their undoing. The following day, I made an unannounced visit to Evan's office. He looked up from his desk, clearly startled, as I stepped inside. Victor, he said, forcing a smile. Didn't expect to see you here. Thought I'd check in, I replied, taking a seat across from him. We haven't talked much since. Well, you know. His smile faltered, and I watched as he scrambled to regain composure. Yeah, I've been meaning to reach out. Things have just been busy. Busy with what? I asked, tilting my head slightly. Work, mostly, he said quickly. You know how it is. Of course, I said, letting the silence stretch. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Is there something on your mind, Victor? A few things, I said, leaning forward. But let's start with this. Are you happy with your role here? Evan blinked, clearly caught off guard. Happy? Yeah, I'd say so. Why? I've been thinking about restructuring, I said, my tone casual. Bringing in new leadership, maybe shifting some responsibilities. Just trying to tighten things up. I see, he said slowly, the tension in his shoulders unmistakable. Don't worry, I added, smiling faintly. Nothing's set in stone yet. Just something to consider. Evan nodded, but the unease in his expression was evident. As I left his office, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. Planting seeds of doubt in his mind was only the beginning. Back home, I received another update from Martin. Found something interesting in Evan's financials, he said over the phone. There's a series of payments to an unregistered entity. Nothing outrageous, but it's consistent. What kind of payments? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. Hard to say without digging deeper, Martin replied. But it's enough to raise questions. Keep digging, I said. That night, I sat in the living room, the quiet of the house amplifying my thoughts. Sophia's betrayal had blindsided me, but now I was beginning to see the larger picture. Evan wasn't just a liar and a cheat. He was sloppy, overconfident, and careless enough to leave a trail. As the pieces began to fall into place, a new resolve took hold. This wasn't just about exposing them. It was about dismantling the lives they'd built on the ruins of my trust. They thought they could outmaneuver me, but they were about to learn I'd been playing a different game all along. A few days later, Martin called with a breakthrough. I traced those payments, he said. They're connected to a small consulting firm. On the surface, it looks legitimate, but there's no actual business activity tied to it. Just a name and an account. What name? I asked, leaning forward in my chair. He hesitated. Sophia Steele. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My grip on the phone tightened, my knuckles whitening. Sophia, I said slowly, as though saying her name aloud would make it less real. Looks like it, Martin confirmed. I can send over the details if you want to dig further. Do it, I said, my voice colder than I intended. When the documents arrived, I pored over them, my anger building with every line. Evan had been funneling money to Sophia under the guise of consulting fees. It wasn't enough to betray me personally. They had found a way to profit from it, too. I stared at the evidence, the weight of their combined betrayal pressing down on me. But instead of breaking, I felt a strange calm settle over me. They thought they were smart, covering their tracks with just enough effort to keep things hidden. But they had underestimated me. And now, I had everything I needed to destroy them. Armed with the discovery of the payments, I began to craft the next stage of my plan. The betrayal had shifted from personal to professional, and that gave me leverage. Sophia and Evan didn't just damage my trust. They had crossed into my world, my company, where I had all the power. The first step was ensuring the evidence was undeniable. I forwarded the documents Martin had uncovered to my legal team with a simple instruction. Prepare a report for internal review. I knew they wouldn't ask questions. Not yet. They'd do their job, and when the time came, I'd have a bulletproof case. Sophia called me that evening, her tone hesitant. Hey, she said softly. I just wanted to check in. Everything's fine, I replied evenly. How are things at your sister's? They're okay, she said. But I miss home, Victor. I miss you. Her words should have stung, but they didn't. Instead, they felt hollow, like an echo of the woman I thought I knew. We'll talk soon, I said, keeping my voice distant. I need time. Of course, she said quickly. Take all the time you need. When we hung up, I sat in the silence, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. In one window was the report on the payments, and in another, the photos of her and Evan. Together, they painted a picture of deception so calculated it made my skin crawl. The next day, I called Evan into my office. He arrived looking uneasy, no doubt still unsettled by our last conversation. "Victor," he said with a forced smile. "What's going on?" I gestured for him to sit. "I've been reviewing some financials," I began, my tone neutral. "There are some irregularities I need your input on." His smile faltered. "Irregularities?" I slid a folder across the desk. Inside were copies of the payments Martin had traced. Evan hesitated before opening it, his face paling as he skimmed the pages. This isn't what it looks like," he stammered. "Then explain it to me," I said, leaning back in my chair. He fumbled for words, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the evidence. "It was a personal matter. I didn't want to involve the company, so I kept it separate." "Separate," I repeated, my tone sharp. "You used company funds to make personal payments." "To my wife." Evan's jaw tightened, and I saw the panic in his eyes. "Victor, I can make this right. It was a mistake." "A mistake," I interrupted, my voice rising. 6 months of payments isn't a mistake, Evan. It's a pattern." He sat there, frozen, as the realization of his position sank in. "I trusted you," I said, my voice cold. "Not just as a friend but as a partner. And this is how you repay me." "I'll resign," he said quickly, desperation creeping into his tone. "I'll step away from the company." "You think that's enough?" I asked, my glare cutting through him. He didn't answer, his silence confirming what I already knew. I leaned forward, my voice low and deliberate. "This isn't over, Evan. Not for you, and not for Sophia. You've taken everything from me, but I'm going to take it all back." The meeting ended with him leaving my office in a daze, his confidence shattered. I watched him go, a grim satisfaction settling over me. This was the beginning of their unraveling. With Evan exposed and Sophia implicated, it was time to act. I had spent weeks gathering evidence, laying the groundwork, and now the moment had come to set the wheels of their downfall in motion. The first step was removing Evan from the company entirely. Not just forcing a resignation, but ensuring his professional reputation was irreparably damaged. I forwarded the findings from the financial audit to the board of directors, presenting the payments as a breach of trust and a misuse of company resources. The fallout was swift. Within 24 hours, Evan was ousted, escorted out of the building by security. I watched from my office window as he left, his shoulders slumped, his once confident stride reduced to a shuffle. But that wasn't enough. Next, I turned my attention to Sophia. She hadn't contacted me since our last conversation, likely sensing that the distance I'd requested wasn't just about time to think. It was about severing ties. I reached out to her sister, pretending to check in. "How's Sophia holding up?" I asked, my tone casual. "She's been quiet," her sister replied hesitantly. "She talks about wanting to fix things, but I don't know, Victor. She seems lost." Good, I thought, though I masked my satisfaction. "Tell her I'll be in touch soon," I said. That night, I sent her an email, cold, formal, and direct. Subject: Separation Agreement. Sophia, I've attached a draft of the terms for our separation. Review them at your earliest convenience. Victor. The attachment included not only the division of assets but also an NDA. If she wanted any part of the life we'd built together, she'd have to agree to stay silent about everything. Her affair with Evan, her involvement in the financial scheme, all of it. I knew she'd push back. Sophia was many things, but compliant wasn't one of them. Sure enough, the next day, my phone rang. "Victor," she said, her voice trembling. "What is this?" "It's exactly what it looks like," I said coolly. "A way to clean up the mess you've made." "A mess I've made," she shot back, her tone rising. "You think this is all on me? You were never there, Victor. Always working, always focused on the company." "Don't you dare," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "Don't you dare blame this on me. You made your choices. Now you get to live with the consequences." She fell silent, the weight of my words sinking in. "You'll get what's fair," I continued, my tone steady. "But nothing more. And if you try to fight me on this, I promise you, Sophia, I will drag you and Evan through every court, every headline, until there's nothing left of your reputations." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But when she spoke again, her voice was hard. "You're not the man I married," she said bitterly. "No," I agreed. "I'm better." I ended the call and leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. The pieces were in place. and now it was only a matter of time before they realized the full extent of what I had done. This was just the beginning. The fallout came faster than I anticipated. Evan, once a man who thrived on his reputation, couldn't handle the pressure of public disgrace. The board's announcement of his dismissal spread like wildfire through industry circles, and whispers of the financial discrepancies followed. He tried to salvage what was left of his career, but no one wanted to associate with a man whose actions hinted at fraud and betrayal. Sophia, on the other hand, held out longer. She hadn't signed the separation agreement yet, likely hoping for a way to regain control. But I wasn't giving her any room to maneuver. The next strike was personal. I leaked the photos Martin had taken of Sophia and Evan to a trusted mutual acquaintance, someone who thrived on gossip and wouldn't hesitate to share the damning images. Within days, the photos were circulating among our social circles. At first, I didn't hear from Sophia. But then, one evening, my phone buzzed with her name flashing on the screen. "What do you want, Sophia?" I asked, my tone clipped. "You did this," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, though my satisfaction was hard to mask. "You leaked those photos," she shouted. "Everyone is talking about it. Our friends, our families. Do you have any idea what this is doing to me?" "Doing to you?" I repeated, my voice cold. "You mean the way you humiliated me? The way you paraded your affair in public, thinking you'd never be caught?" "This isn't fair, Victor," she said, her voice breaking. "Fair?" I said, the word bitter on my tongue. "Don't talk to me about fairness. You and Evan made your choices. Now you're dealing with the consequences." She was silent for a moment, and then, in a quieter voice, she said, "I didn't think you had it in you." "You don't know me as well as you think," I said before ending the call. The final blow came the following week. The separation agreement had been revised, harsher, tighter, and sent to Sophia's lawyer. With no leverage left and her reputation in tatters, she had no choice but to sign. Evan, meanwhile, was floundering. Word of his affair with a married woman added a scandalous edge to his professional disgrace. His attempts to start anew were met with closed doors and cold shoulders. I watched from a distance as their lives unraveled. It wasn't about joy or satisfaction. It was about justice. They had torn apart everything I held dear, and now they were paying the price. In the quiet of my home, I finally felt the weight of their betrayal lift. The house was mine again. My space. My sanctuary. The garden I'd neglected for weeks called to me, and I spent an afternoon pulling weeds, planting new seeds. As the sun set, I sat on the porch, a cup of coffee in hand, and for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. They were living in the wreckage of their own choices. And I was free.